so glad you folks could come out tonight. I'm sorry that I can't be there with you this evening, but thank you for your faithfulness in showing up and supporting what we're doing here at the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society. Last month, we talked about the fact that when it comes to property, when it comes to the results of our labor, and enjoying the fruits, shall we say, of our labor, only two things can happen. Either we will work and enjoy the fruits of our labor, or we will work and someone else will enjoy the fruits of our labor through warfare. There's no third way. And we've asked this question, have you ever contemplated the setting of Christ's parables? The majority of them deal with work. In fact, we said it's hard to name two or three in a row that don't include that particular subject. Christ came that we might have life and that more abundantly. When Christ came himself, before he ever did a single miracle, think about this. Think about what he did. His father was a carpenter, and he learned those skills. Now, think about this. He could have come and he fed 5,000. He could have done that at any moment and just fed himself. But he came and he worked. Please think about that. He dignified work. We can't have any greater affirmation of work than that of Christ himself, who could have had anything he wanted, and yet he worked with his own two hands to provide for himself and for his family, apparently, at some points anyway, as we see Paul doing in Ephesians, or with the Ephesian elders there in Acts chapter 20, where he says, "These hands have provided for me and those who are with me." In other words, Paul knew something about work. Now, when Christ talks about having, saying that he came that we might have life and that more abundantly, oftentimes, so often, we spiritualize that to say, yeah, he came to give us eternal life. And yet, please think of this. Christ did not come to give eternal life and leave us in the condition in which he found us in our society and in our homes and in our culture. He came to give life and more abundant life wherever life is found, wherever it be found. And that's why we see the wonderful contributions that Christianity has made throughout the earth, especially in this area of work. There is no way abundant life is possible without work. Someone, somewhere, has to produce. Now, I just want to talk briefly, just very briefly, about this issue of inheritance. We used to, in this country, during the colonial periods, we had an idea of securing the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. In fact, constitutional scholars in the room will recognize that phrase from the Constitution. Secure the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity. Inheritance taxes attack the blessings of liberty for our posterity. That's why one of the reasons why inheritance taxes should be abolished and attacked and challenged all along the way. What gives the state the right to inherit your labor? You see, somebody's going to inherit your labor. Somebody is. It's either going to be your posterity or it's going to be the state. And speaking of the blessings of liberty for ourselves and our posterity, think of those who loved you even before you were born. You probably didn't build the house that you live in. You probably didn't build the road that you drove here on, didn't build the car that you drove here in. So many things were done by people. You didn't clear the land. So much was done by people other than us. Someone loved us. Someone secured the blessings of liberty for their posterity, of which you and I are. If no one produces, then no one benefits from production. Godless cultures will, over time, be based on power, not production. Now then, there are only two ways to gain the benefits of production, as we said, work or theft. Of these two, only Christianity is sustainable over time because it alone is completely hostile to plunder. All other belief systems embrace plunder at some point. Some are even based on it. You think about the Christian system, and think about Christ himself. Christ came, he worked with his hands. Please think about this. He could have fed himself any time with another miracle, right? He fed the 5,000, no problem whatsoever. He could have gone through life doing miracles to feed himself. He didn't do it. He worked. Christ himself dignified work, loving one's neighbor through production, through making things that our neighbors can use, through taking dominion over the resources of the earth. Christ himself dignified work, and there are many, I'm one of them, that believes the original attack on slavery, which we'll talk about in a minute, came through the work and ministry of Jesus Christ. He dignified working with his own hands in the Roman culture, which, by the way, at that point, looked down on working with one's hands. And we say that all of the belief systems embrace plunder at some point. Some are even based on it. Think of think of socialism. And in fact, in the book that we hand out to every new person here at Mars, the Mid-Atlantic Reformation Society, Law and Liberty, if you get a chance, check out your copy of that book in chapter 29, Socialism as a Perpetual Civil War, in which Rushdoony articulately makes the points that we've been trying to make throughout this presentation, and that is that as long as socialism is legitimized, then war against one's neighbor is legitimized, because in socialism, envy is enshrined and covetousness is enshrined. It's a constant war against our neighbor's goods. It's not a war so much against our neighbor that has nothing, because we don't care about his goods, he doesn't have any. It's a war against our productive neighbors, the ones who have goods. And I hope you get a chance to read that chapter, because he absolutely makes the case. In socialism, the elite or the state has the goods, has the guns to take property away from their neighbors, and their neighbors try to protect the producers try to protect themselves, and you have constant warfare. And I would go as far to say that any other system other than Christianity is at some point based on plunder or accepts plunder, not Christianity. Well, our thesis in our first presentation was that when it comes to production and resources, only one of two things can happen with respect to our neighbor. Either one, we'll take dominion over the resources of the earth and serve our neighbor through production, or we will attack our neighbor's production through plunder. We also said that many of Christ's parables have to do with work, as well as pointing out that the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31 demonstrates the virtues of work. And think about that. Here's a virtuous woman. Now, when you and I would talk about what a virtuous woman is, we might say a lot of things, but if you look at the Proverbs 31 passage, a lot of it has to do with her ability to produce, her ability to serve her family through work. In a moment, we will look at some of these parables, as well as take a look at the husband of the Proverbs 31 woman. But before we do that, we need to talk briefly about the issue of slavery. Slavery is an outworking of our work or war thesis in this sense. In plunder, a man attacks his neighbor's property, while in slavery, a man attacks his neighbor's labor. In both cases, the result is the same: war against his neighbor in labor or property. And frankly, we see no difference between the two. It is for these reasons that we say that the forcible collection of taxes is ungodly, because that process legitimizes the plunder of our neighbor's labor. This is a working definition of slavery, the ownership of the labor of another. And my friends, forcible taxation says that the state or some other entity has a right to his neighbor's labor. That's slavery. It's just that simple. If I have to go out and I have to work, and my neighbor or somebody else has a right, inherent right, to some or all of my labor, I'm a slave. It's that simple. In fact, in our country, and you get this from the book Voices from Slavery, which I've read, and you can get a chance to read that if you want. There were slaves in North America that bought their own freedom, because what some of their owners did was they said, look, if you work during the day, you can work your own gardens, you can work your own industry in your time off. And some of them did that. Some of them created businesses, they grew gardens, they sold, they bought, and they eventually bought their own freedom. Well, they were officially slaves, but the only time they were officially slaves is when they were actually working for their owner. But the other time they were actually free to do what they wanted. And at that point, they were not slaves in the sense that we know it. So the ownership of the labor of another is slavery, and forcibly collected taxes, that's our point here, are a legitimization of slavery to the state. Now let's just take a quick look at some of Christ's earliest parables. We said before that Christ, in the New Testament, Christ begins his parables there in Matthew chapter 12, and actually Matthew chapter 13, because Matthew chapter 12 being one of the most important chapters, I would argue, in all of Scripture, because that is where we see Christ condemning those who rejected him and saying, look, you're never going to believe on me. I'm going to send you prophets. I'm going to send you priests. I'm going to send you Levites even. And some you'll kill, some you'll crucify, some you'll beat, whatever. That the blood of Abel to the blood of Zechariah might be exacted, if you will, by this generation. So after that, he basically said, look, you're never going to believe. So after that, he begins to talk in parables. That's where we see the beginning of parables in the New Testament, Matthew chapter 13. And he starts out in Matthew chapter 13 with the parable of the sower. Then he goes to the wheat and the tares, the mustard seed, the leavened bread, the hidden treasure, and the pearl of great price. Now, I'm just going to ask you, I hope you can remember these parables in Matthew 13. We're not going to go, we don't have time to go through every single one of these. But in these parables, we can see that these parables confirm the virtue and value of work. That is, when Christ was explaining the kingdom of heaven, he turned to work to have the listeners understand. It is difficult, if not impossible, to understand the parables if we don't understand the virtue and value of work. Think of it this way. Christ says, my kingdom is like this particular aspect of work. Now, it's true that not every aspect of dominion is covered by these parables, but let's see what is covered. In other words, I want to be clear here. We're not saying that Christ of the kingdom of heaven is like work. He didn't say it in that sense. But he took various aspects of work that his people would have understood and said the kingdom of heaven is like this. Now we have to stop here for a minute. And we have to talk about how difficult it is to explain the Christian experience to people who are not used to working. Have you ever tried it? It's one of the reasons why we see so few successful churches in the inner city. We have some churches in the inner city, we do. But oftentimes the churches in the city are often attended and run by people from outside the city. A big reason is because we have not taught these generations the value and the ability, the value of, and the ability to work. They don't understand it. And I have to challenge you here right now. If we're talking to people that don't understand work, we're talking to people that are not going to, not going to understand the kingdom of heaven, or at least have a very difficult time understanding the kingdom of heaven, because Christ begins his illustrations of what the kingdom of heaven is like with an implied understanding that they knew something about work. What kind of work? Well, the parables, let's take a look. The parable of the sower, farming, sowing, or planting. The parable of the wheat and the tares obviously has to do with reaping. You're not going to sow if you're not going to plan to reap. And the parable of the mustard seed is interesting because it's a tree, but it says that the farmer actually planted the tree. And the birds of the air collected in its branches. And that was a similar statement of what Daniel said, what was happening with King Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, King Nebuchadnezzar's domination of the world in that sense was so broad that you could not even define your existence without defining it in relation to King Nebuchadnezzar. He dominated the world to that degree. And that's what Christ is saying the kingdom of heaven is like. One day, we will all define our existence as it relates to the kingdom of heaven. That's the point of the parable there. We don't want to get into too much into that. But the farmer himself planted that seed. That seed did not get there on its own. It was deliberately planted. It was work. And fourthly, we see the woman who took leaven and put it in her bread so the bread would rise. So we see homemaking, baking bread. We see trading after that. We see that in the parable of the The hidden treasure. Again, this is again the kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which when a man found and hid, for joy he goes out and he sells all that he has and buys the field. So we see trading, and then finally we see merchandising. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls, who, when he had found some pearl of great price, went and sold what he had and bought it. So we see the production in these parables. We see production, we see merchandising, we see trade. We see all of business presented in Christ's parables. Again, I must ask, if work is not part of the Christian experience, how are we even going to begin to understand Christ's parables? So we see Christ using parables that center around work, illustrates the value of work, the variety of work, sowing, reaping, merchandising, and the vision of work, especially there in the last pearl of great price. And that's what we're going to talk about. Now, would we want to attack that guy and say, oh, we found one pearl of great price? This is Matthew 13:46. He goes and sells all that he has and he buys it. He doesn't need that pearl of great price. He probably has enough, blah, blah, blah. Well, we're gonna talk about that a little bit later on our presentation, because that has become legitimized even in our Christian circles. In many Christian circles, it's a legitimate exercise to sit around and talk about people who are productive and discuss how much they really need to live on. And frankly, it's none of these people sitting around that should actually be getting to work themselves and loving their neighbor through some sort of production. They frankly need to get out and actually be like their productive neighbor instead of sitting around talking about how to plunder his goods. But anyway, let's just take a quick look at the husband, quote unquote, of the virtuous woman of Proverbs 31. And there were some statements in Proverbs 31. Let's back up a little bit. We said earlier tonight, and we saw last month, that she works extremely hard and she produces goods. And she, frankly, is a very important person in the neighborhood, because she spreads value, she creates value for herself, for her family, for her neighbors. And let's look, though, at her husband. It says, the heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. Her husband is known in the gates when he sits among the elders of the land. Now, let's think about this for a minute. Let's look at this both spiritually and materially. Spiritually speaking, the husband of the Proverbs 31 woman is Christ, in the sense that she is doing what needs to be done at home. Now, what do you mean by that? Well, let's look at what she's doing. She's taking care of her family. She's helping the poor. This is all in Proverbs 31. She's creating goods for her neighbors, and she's creating profits for the entire community. In that sense, my friends, she is doing the work of the church. Christ expects his church to do the work he has commanded her to do. Remember, her husband is in the gates. The message of Christ in the gates is most powerful when his church is doing her job. Loving our neighbors, working, doing our own business, spreading the gospel, teaching people what it means to obey Christ in every area of life, and doing it ourselves. When we do that, our message, when we preach, is so much more powerful. But you know what's happening today? And I hate saying this, but I would argue this. The more the church looks like the world, and the less we distinguish our message from that of the world and our lifestyle, then the less powerful our message really is. And it seems like today we are all about accommodating our message to the world rather than challenging the world with our message. Do our job as Christendom, frankly, once did. I mean, how do you think Europe became Christianized? When the early missionaries came to Europe, they met up with child sacrifice. They met up with ritual sacrifices of human sacrifices of various tribes. The tribes of Europe were really no different from any other tribe. They were wicked, godless, cruel, but Europe became Christianized. How? Europe became Christianized through the proclamation and practice of the gospel. And if we don't practice the gospel, our proclamation of it is going to be, frankly, insignificant. Now, let's take a look also at a husband who was in the gates. This is more materially speaking, showing us the power and influence of a godly husband and father who had the resources to promote goodness, mercy, justice, compassion, and general love to his neighbor. And who am I talking about here? Well, yes, I am talking about that godly man whose name is Job. Let's just take a quick look at Job and his ability to love his neighbor and to love his family, and how he could use his material goods to spread a lot of goodness around his own personal neighborhood. Job is going to show us the wonderful results of hard work and material, yes, I did say material success. Yes, material success is good and it is godly. I'm going to read from Job chapter 29, verse 1. And this is, let me just give you a little background here. This is when Job is justifying himself to his three friends. Now, you remember his three friends came to speak with him and to try to comfort him. They tried as hard as they could, but their comfort was misery to Job because they kept on trying to get Job to admit that he had sinned some great sin against God. And that's why God was doing what he was to Job, taking away his family, taking away his health, taking away his material goods, taking away everything of value to him, except for his wife, if you will. He took it all away, and they said, Job, just confess what you've done. We know you've done something. Job, we want to help you. Job, just confess it, and then God may restore you. And Job kept defending himself, said, I haven't done anything. And what happens in Job chapters 29 through 31 is Job begins a discourse in which he justifies himself and says, this is the way I was. I didn't do anything wrong. After that, Elihu, a fourth person, comes in and challenges Job. And then after that, God comes in and speaks with Job. But in chapter 29, Job begins to tell us what he had spoken before this, but in chapter 29, he begins his defense, if you will, of himself. And he says this, he says, oh, that I were as in months past, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and when by his light I walked through darkness, just as I was in the days of my prime, when the friendly counsel of God was over my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me, when my children were around me. And I want to start there. When my children were around, Job took a long-term view of things. Recently my wife and I met a young guy, who flat out told us that he's only going to have one child because children cost a lot of money, and he wants his kid to go to the best school, and so therefore he can only have one. Now you have to think about that for a minute. Earlier we talked about securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity from the Constitution. Securing the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. Now this man thinks that he's securing blessings of liberty to his posterity, to his son. But you know what? If his son just has one child, and they, in 4 or 5, it's not going to take long. 4 or 5 generations, you're not going to have any posterity at all. Each generation, the nation will have half the inhabitants that it had before. He's not having a long-term, he's a very short-term view. But Job ministered, and one of the earliest things he says about his own ministry, when he lived, he said his children were around him. He was going to teach his children his ways. We see that in chapter 1 as well, where he offered sacrifices on behalf of his children. And he was apparently a very, very tight family with Job. because when all 10 children died, they were all one of their other brothers' houses, and they were feasting there, probably having some sort of a picnic or who knows, a formal feast or whatever, but they were together. It was a very tight family, and that was because Job wanted to teach them godly ways. It wasn't good enough to just send them off to some pagan school where they would learn how to read and write, if they're even taught that anymore. No, he taught them himself. Job had a long-term view, but let's see what else. He was a benefactor of the poor. Let's keep reading. Verse 7, when I went out to the gate by, this is Job chapter 29, when I went out to the gate by the city, when I took my seat in the open square, the young men saw me and hid, and the aged arose and stood. The princes refrained from talking, put their hand on their mouth. The voice of nobles was hushed, and their tongue stuck to the roof of their mouth. When the ear heard, then it blessed me, and when the eye saw, it approved me. Did you hear what Job just said here? He says, when I went out to the gate by the city, that's where Job spent an awful lot of his time. He was out of the gates like the husband of the woman there in Proverbs 31. And he spoke with such authority that princes and nobles listened to what he said. And one of the first things he talks about then is in verse 12. He says, because, this is why they listened to him, because I delivered the poor who cried out, the fatherless and the one who had no helper. So he had a long-term view. He was a benefactor of the poor. A poor person came to Job, and if an injustice had been done, as we'll see later, then Job would challenge that injustice. So he was also a benefactor of the poor. Then we see that he was a defender of the defenseless. He says this in verse 13, the blessing of a perishing man came upon me, and I caused the widow's heart to sing for joy. And we say a defender of the defenseless. Oftentimes in these cultures, a widow just had no one to stick up for her. No one. Where could she go for justice? Well, when Job was alive, when things were done at home, when he was producing as he had tremendous goods, he was able to be in the gates, and a defenseless person like a widow who needed justice could come and find Job. So he had a long-term view, a benefactor of the poor, a defender of the defenseless, and okay, let's see what else. A deliverer of justice. Verse 14, I put on righteousness and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. Wow. Wow. Honestly, do we know any politician that could even come close to that? Honestly, let me read that again. Let me read that. I put on righteousness and it clothed me. My justice was like a robe and a turban. At a time when a robe and a turban pretty much defined a man's clothes, Job was saying, people saw me, and they saw a man of justice and a man of righteousness. Kind of opposite of what our envious socialists, be they so-called Christian or not, say. And I get it that we live in a time when many people have become wealthy through plundering their neighbor. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about people who have worked hard, produced things, products, if you will, that their neighbors can use, and now they've become wealthy. See, Job didn't plunder anybody. He had all those sheep, all those camel, all those oxen, all those servants. He didn't plunder anyone. He was a man of justice. Can we say that? Can you say that about yourself? You know, what if you were suddenly extremely wealthy and had nothing to do with sit in the gates? Let's say sit up on Capitol Hill and dispense wisdom. Would people say that about you? Would people say that about me? Well, that was what was said about Job. A man who delivered justice. Let's see what else. A helper of the helpless. He says, I was eyes to the blind, with verse 15, and I was feet to the lame. People that needed help. People that couldn't function as well as other people could, had a benefactor in Job. He had the means, he had the goods, he had the exposure. People knew him. He was feet. Think about that. He was feet to the lame and eyes to the blind. Yeah, the lame and the blind had a great disadvantage, but you know what? They also had Job, who could help them. And see, not only a helper of the helpless here, but also a producer of relevant information. Look at this. He says, I was a father to the poor, verse 16, and I searched out the case that I did not know. So if there was a case where people did not know what the answer was or how to find out the answer, Job says he figured it out for him. Job would go to battle on their behalf, and he'd find out what was going on, and he'd get to the bottom of it. He searched out the case that he didn't know. He just wasn't sitting passive saying, well, hey, you go figure it out. I said, no, there were times when apparently only he could get to the bottom of something, and he did. Now, I've got to ask you even at this point, is this a godly and good man? Of course it is, but there's one more thing. One more thing, and I think this last item here is one of the reasons why the state hates godly, productive men so much. Lastly, he was a terror to the wicked. Verse 17, I broke the fangs of the wicked and plucked the victim from his teeth. Now, he says, I broke their fangs. I did two things. If I was early enough on the scene, I broke their fangs. If I got on the scene a little bit later, then I plucked the victim right out of his teeth. Now, most animals that are going to, a wolf tearing up the flock or a tiger or whatever, they're not going to appreciate it when you run up and take the victim right out of their teeth. They worked hard to get that victim, and by George, they're going to enjoy the victim. Job says, not with me around. Now, can you see what a problem he was to wicked men who go to war against their neighbor's goods? You see, with a Job around, they had a much harder time enjoying their neighbor's property because Job was a man of justice, and he would not put up with it. We need to understand something here. We need to understand that Job would be under tremendous attack today because he was officially rich, bad guy. He had so much more than he needed. And in our minds today, that's almost like theft. Even if a person produced his own goods, it's still almost like that. Look at all the things that he has. There's other people that need blah, 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 blah. Well, he didn't steal from anybody. He created it. And thirdly, he was righteous. Let me ask you something. Does a man like this fit in well with our society? I hope we all see this. When we attack the Jobs of the world, that should be a capital J, forgive me for that. When we attack the Jobs of the world, we are attacking the virtues that they bring to our society, our culture, and our neighbors. Yes, the wicked would destroy Job and his virtues. Do remember this. That is not collateral damage. That was and is the goal the whole time. Do you think the wicked who attack the Jobs of the world are really all that concerned that their virtues go with them? They hate the virtues and they hate the one who presents those virtues. And the Jobs of the world, dispensing justice, plucking the victim from the teeth of the wicked, make enemies, quite frankly, of the wicked themselves. Listen, my friends, you cannot attack a man's material success without attacking his virtues if he has gained his material success through hard, honest work. The enemies of the rich are very often the enemies of the virtuous. Please understand this, and I'm trying as hard as I possibly can to make this point here. Do you understand, if we progressively taxed away Job's wealth, that we would have destroyed the man that we saw here in Proverbs chapter 29? A man who defended the defenseless, a man who dispensed justice, a man who was feet to the lame and eyes to the blind. Hey, progressive taxation would destroy him. How much more good things would be happening today if we were not attacking the wealth of our neighbor? See, that's our idea. See, we have to take away Job's goods in order for the state to dispense justice and be eyes to the blind and so forth. Well, hey, You know what? It may look good on paper to some people. Frankly, it doesn't look good even on paper anymore. It frankly never did. But it's ungodly. It's unbiblical. And it's sinful. And the last commandment, coveting your neighbor's goods, is entirely against this idea that somehow the state is going to be the one who dispenses all these good things. We don't see that in Scripture. We see instead the Jobs of the world dispensing goodness and righteousness. And frankly, one final example, Barzillai from 2 Samuel 17 and 19. I'll just read this very quickly and give you some background. And Barzillai the Gileadite came down from Rogelim and went across the Jordan with the king to escort him across the Jordan. Now Barzillai was a very aged man, 80 years old, and he had provided the king with supplies while he was staying at Menahem, for he was a very rich man. Now let me give you the background here. David was on the run from his son Absalom, who was taking over the kingdom. You may recall the case. Poor Absalom is a definite illustration of a failure of, shall we say, democracy. In this sense, Absalom was tremendous at getting elected king, but extremely poor at being the king. And that's the problem we have, isn't it? We might have a great campaigner, a person who can get votes, but how do we know that person, once he's, or she, I guess nowadays, I suppose, is in office, how that person is going to function once they're there? And David's son Absalom was tremendous at getting the votes, but very poor at administering the kingdom once he had the votes. And he did have the votes, at least for a short time. In any case, he manages to chase David away from the capital. David and his supporters make it far enough away that they cross the Jordan River into the area of Gilead, where 2.5 tribes resided. David and his men were completely famished. They were totally tired. They had no strength whatsoever. If Absalom would have attacked at that point, it would have been the end of David. But David and his people and his supporters, if you will, they get restored once they get on the other side of the Jordan. Now, how do they get restored? Well, they get restored through this godly, rich, he was very rich, man named Barzillai. And the scriptures tell us that he gave them raisins, he gave them all kinds of food, he refreshed them, they got their strength back, so that when Absalom came to attack David, David was able to win that battle because he had his strength back. Now, please listen to what I'm saying here. We saw back last month that those socialists of Proverbs chapter 1, cast in your lot among us, let us all have one purse, blah, blah, blah. We saw in Proverbs 1 that they lay in wait, Solomon says, for their own lives. In other words, the socialists will eventually run out, the parasites will eventually run out of hosts, or if they don't even run out of hosts, they'll eventually attack each other and kill each other. If David would have been a confiscatory civil magistrate, attacking the wealth of Barzillai, if he would have done that, then he would have taken away his own ability to survive the coup that his son brought on his kingdom. Barzillai would have had nothing left. He wouldn't have had any goods to give David. Now, we can stand around and say, well, what's Barzillai going to do with all these goods and all this food and all these servants and all this stuff? Well, you know what? You don't know what crisis is coming. You and I do not know what's coming up in the future. And Barzillai was able to use his material goods to sustain the kingdom. Now, you think about that. The kingdom at that point was held in the balance in the hand of one very rich man. Because I want to tell you something. If there's no Barzillai here from 2 Samuel 17 and 19, Absalom becomes king. And I frankly think that I honestly believe that would have been the end of the Jewish nation, quite frankly. Who knows what he would have done. But he would never have been. He couldn't even take care of David when he was when he was famished, when he was just about done. The kingdom of Israel would have been completely overrun, and you would have seen. I think the kingdom of Israel, which was 12 tribes at that time, it would have been like what happened later with the 10 tribes. That had just been carried off and just never would have heard of them again. David was able to survive this coup attempt because a rich man, a rich, productive man existed in his kingdom, and David had apparently let him alone so that he could accumulate his goods. And this man then was able to do a wonderful service to David. He was able to do good with his own goods. And my friends, again, I want to make the point, and I want to wrap up saying this. If an honest man or woman, as we saw in Proverbs 31, makes money, gains wealth by the work of their hands and by their skill in business, it is a godless thing and a disgusting thing and a wicked thing to attack that person's property through war. Because you are attacking the very virtues that help them gain what they've gained if they've done it honestly. And you and I must oppose all attempts to attack our neighbor's wealth through the power of the state. It's ungodly, it's unbiblical, and it is a war against not only their neighbor's goods, but also against virtue itself. And I want to thank you tonight for kind attention.